Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back.
for suspicion of Lutheranism, and some other crimes. Edicts against Lutherans, Illuminati, and c. the Inquisitor General, who perceived the necessity of arresting the progress of Lutheranism in Spain, decreed, in concert with the Council of the Inquisition, several new articles in addition to the annual edict. These articles oblige every Christian to declare, if he knows or has heard of any person who has said, maintained, or thought that the sect of Luther is good, or that his partisans will be saved, and approved, nor believed any of his condemned propositions, for example, that it is not necessary to confess sins to a priest, and that it is sufficient to confess to God, that neither the Pope nor the priests have the power of remitting sins, that the body of Jesus is not actually present in the consecrated host, that it is not permitted to pray to saints, or expose images in churches, that faith and baptism are sufficient for salvation, and that good works are not necessary, that every Christian may, although not of the priesthood, receive the confession of another Christian, and administer the sacrament to him, that the Pope has not the power of granting indulgences, that priests and monks may lawfully marry, that God did not establish the regular religion's orders, that the state of marriage is better and more perfect than that of celibacy, that there ought to be no festivals but the Sabbath, and that it is not sinful to eat meat on Friday, in Lent, or on other fast days. Alfonso Manrique also gave permission to the inquisitors of the provinces to take any measures they might think proper, to discover those persons who had embraced the heresy of the Illuminati, Alumbrados. These people, who were also called Dejados, Quietists, formed a sect whose chief, it is said, was that Munzer who had already established that of the Anabaptists. Some time after, the Council of the Inquisition added several articles relative to the Illuminati to those already mentioned. I am of opinion, that the first Spaniards who followed the doctrines of Luther were Franciscan monks, for Clement VII. In 1526, authorized the general and provincials of the Order of Minor Friars of St. Francis de Assise, to absolve those of the community who had fallen into that heresy, after they had taken an oath to renounce it forever. Several monks of the same order had already represented to the Pope, that by the privileges granted to them in the Bull Mare Magnum, and confirmed by other decrees of the Holy See, no stranger had a right to interfere in their affairs, and that they did not recognize any judge but the judge of their institution, even in cases of apostasy. Manrique, embarrassed in his ministry by the pretensions of the Franciscans, wrote to the Pope, who expedited, in 1525, a brief, by which the Inquisitor General was empowered to take cognizance of these affairs, assisted by a monk named by the prelate of the order, and that, in cases of appeal from judgment, the Pope should be applied to, but these appeals were afterwards ordered to be made before the Inquisitor General. Trials of several persons. During the ministry of the Inquisitor General Manrique, history points out several illustrious and innocent victims of the tribunal, who were suspected of Lutheranism. Such was the Venerable Juan de Avila, who would have been beatified, if he had been a monk, but he was only a secular priest. He was called, in Spain, the Apostle of Andalusia, on account of his exemplary life and his charitable actions. Actions. St. Teresa de Jesus informs us, in her works, that she derived much assistance from his counsels and doctrine. He preached the gospel with simplicity, and never introduced into his discourses those questions which at that time so disgracefully agitated the scholastic theologians. Some envious monks, irritated at his aversion for disputes, united to plan his ruin. They denounced some of his propositions to the Inquisition, as tending to Lutheranism and the doctrines of the Illuminati. In 1534, Juan de Avila was confined in the secret prison of the Holy Office, by an order of the inquisitors, who
Finding
did
about
not
that,
make their resolution
oh, the
known to the Supreme
Illuminati.
Council or to the
Real.
ordinary, on the pretense that this measure was only ordained in case of a difference of opinion. Although this proceeding was contrary to the laws of the Inquisition, to the royal ordinances, and those of the Supreme Council, yet they condemned these violations, and even tacitly approved them, as no reprimand was addressed to the offenders. This act of the Inquisition, which took place at Seville, much affected the Inquisitor General. He occupied the see of that city, and had the greatest esteem for Juan de Avila, whom he regarded as a saint, which was a fortunate circumstance for him, as the protection of Manrique, as chief of the Inquisition, greatly contributed to prove his innocence. De Avila was acquitted, and continued to preach with the same zeal and charity until his death. This year was more fatal to two men, who are celebrated in the literary history of Spain: Juan de Vergara, and Bernardine de Tobar, his brother. They were arrested by the Inquisition of Toledo, and were not released from its dungeons, until they had been subjected to the abjuration, de levi, of the Lutheran heresy, to receive the absolution of censures ad cautelam, and to several penances. Juan de Vergara was a canon of Toledo, and had been secretary to Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros, and to Don Alfonso de Fonseca, his successor in the see of that city. Nicolas Antonio has inserted, in his library, a notice of the literary productions of this Spaniard, and does justice to his virtue and merit. His profound knowledge of the Greek and Hebrew languages was the cause of his misfortune. He had remarked some faults in the translation of the Vulgate, and thus gave the signal for persecution to some monks who had only studied Latin and the jargon of the schools. The chapter of Toledo honored his memory in placing on his tomb an epitaph, which is preserved by the author I have cited. Vergara had a claim on the gratitude of this community, for having composed the inscriptions which decorate the choir of their church. Bernardine de Tobar is less known, but Peter Martyr de Angleria mentions him among the learned men of the 16th century, and John Louis Vives, a learned man of that age, says, in writing to Erasmus, "We live in a difficult time, it is dangerous either to speak or be silent." Vergara, his brother Bernardine de Tobar, and several other learned men, have been arrested in Spain. 7. Among this number was one of whom Vives could not give a particular account. I speak of Alfonso Virues, a Benedictine, born at Almedo, and one of the best theologians of his time. He had a profound knowledge of the Oriental languages, and had composed several works. He was a member of the commission which judged the works of Erasmus in 1527, and preacher to Charles V, who listened to his discourses with so much pleasure that he took him to Germany, and on his return to Spain would not hear any other person. These distinctions excited the envy of the monks, and they would have succeeded in their endeavors to ruin him, but for the firmness and constancy of the emperor in protecting him. Virues was suspected of being favorable to the opinions of Luther, and thrown into the secret prisons of the Holy Office at Seville. The emperor, who knew him well, both from his sermons and the intercourse which took place during their travels in Germany, felt this blow acutely, and not doubting that Virues was the victim of an intrigue which the Inquisitor General ought to have prevented, he exiled Manrique, who was obliged to retire to his archbishopric of Seville, where he died in 1538. Not content with this, Charles commanded the Supreme Council to address an ordinance to all the tribunals of the Inquisition, importing, that in case of a preliminary instruction sufficiently serious to cause the arrest of a monk, the decree of imprisonment should be delayed, and that the inquisitors should send an entire and faithful copy of the commencement of the proceedings to the Supreme Council, and wait for the orders which would be sent them after the examination of the writings. The unfortunate Virues, nevertheless, suffered all the horrors of a secret imprisonment for 4 years. During this period, as he writes to Charles V, he was scarcely allowed to breathe, or to occupy himself with anything but charges, replies, testimonies, defenses, libels. Libels means acts, nomina qui et ipso pontimendo sono. Words which cannot be heard without terrors, or with heresies, blasphemies, errors, anathemas, schisms, and other monsters, which, with labor that may be compared to those of Hercules, I have at last conquered with the aid of Jesus Christ, so that I am now justified through your Majesty's protection aid. One of the means employed by Viros for his defense, was to demand that the tribunal should pay attention to the points of doctrine which he had established, and prepared to attack Melanchthon and other Lutherans before the Diet of Ratisbon, but this demand did not gain the object which he had in view, which was a complete absolution, because his enemies had denounced propositions advanced in public. Although he proved that they were extremely Catholic, when examined with the text, yet he could not prevent them from incurring the theological censure in the form given by the denunciation. He was obliged to submit to an abjuration of all heresies, particularly that of Luther and his adherents. The definitive sentence was pronounced in 1537, he was declared to be suspected of professing the errors of Luther, and condemned to be absolved from the censures ad cautelam, to be confined in a monastery for 2 years, and prohibited from preaching the word of God for 2 years after his release. The emperor, when informed of these transactions, complained to the Pope, who, in 1538, addressed a brief to Viros, which contained a dispensation from the different penances to which he had been condemned. It also reinstated him in his office of preacher, and declared, that what had passed could not exclude him from any office, not even from episcopacy. It is surprising that the affair of Viros, and many others, did not make Charles V perceive the nature of the Inquisition, and that he still continued to protect that institution. However, the trial of his preacher, and several other crosses which he experienced about that time, were the reasons why he deprived the Holy Office of the royal jurisdiction in 1535. And it was not restored until the year 1545. This favor for Viros was so constant, that he soon after presented him to the Pope for the bishopric of the Canaries, but the Pope refused him, alleging that the suspicions raised against the purity of his faith rendered him improper to be invested with the dignity of a bishop, although the bull had declared him to be eligible. The emperor insisted, and the Pope at length yielded to his pressing solicitations. Viros was made Bishop of the Canaries in 1540. In 1527 the Inquisition of Valladolid was occupied by an affair, of which it is necessary to give an account, that the compassion and indulgence which the inquisitors always professed in their acts, and other forms of justice, may be justly appreciated. One Diego Vallejo, of the village of Palacios de Menezes, in the Diocese of Palencia, having been arrested for blasphemy by the Inquisition, declared, among other things, that 2 months before, on the 24th of April, 1526, 2 physicians, named Alfonso Garcia and Juan de Salas, were disputing on the subject of medicine, before him and Ferdinand Ramirez, his son. In law, the first maintained his opinion on the authority of certain writers, Salas affirmed that these writers were deceived, Garcia replied that his opinion was proved by the text of the evangelists, which caused Salas to say that they had lied as well as the others. Ferdinand Ramirez, who had also been arrested upon suspicion of Judaism, was examined the same day. His deposition was the same as that of Vallejo, but he added that Salas returned to his house some hours after, and in speaking of what had passed, said, "What folly I have asserted." When the tribunal had finished the affair of Ramirez and Vallejo, they arrested Juan de Salas. The inquisitors, without the concurrence of the diocesan, without consultors or qualifiers, and without communicating with the Supreme Council, decreed the arrest of Juan de Salas on the 14th of February, 1527, as if the declarations of Ramirez and Vallejo had been sufficient. The audiences of admonition were granted, and the depositions were communicated without the names of the persons or place. He replied that the circumstances were not correctly stated. The other physician was then called, who declared, that in conversing with Salas on the evangelists, he heard him say, that some of them had lied. He was asked if anyone had reproached Salas for this expression. Garcia replied, that an hour after he had advised him to give himself up to the Inquisition, and that he had promised to do so. The inquisitor then asked if he was inimical to the accused. The witness replied in the negative. On the 16th of April the ratification of Ramirez and Garcia took place. On the 6th of May the prisoner presented two requisitions or means of defense. In the first he protested against all that had been said contrary to his declaration, and pointed out the differences in the depositions of the witnesses. The second was an interrogatory in 13 questions, 2 of which tended to prove his orthodoxy, and the others to justify the motives of the challenge which he had presented against certain persons who had been called upon to depose in his trial. This piece contains, in the margin, the witnesses to be consulted for each question. It will be seen that the prisoner took advantage of the laws of the Holy Office in his defense, but the inquisitors, instead of conforming to their own regulations, erased the names of several persons designated in the list of the accused witnesses on his side, and would not hear them. Nevertheless, the facts mentioned in the interrogatory were proved by 14 witnesses, and on the 25th of May the fiscal gave his conclusions. The fact related by Ramirez, the contradictions in the depositions of the witnesses, the difference in the report of both, from that of the accuser, the important advantages gained by the prisoner in justifying his challenge, in only having two witnesses against him, who had both been prosecuted, one for blasphemy, the other for Judaism, and in being accused of only one proposition. Lastly, the possibility that the accused had forgotten many things during the space of a year, are circumstances which would make anyone suppose that Juan de Salas would have been acquitted, or that they would, at least, if they supposed that he had denied the truth, have contented themselves with imposing the penance of the suspicion de levi upon him. But instead of this, the Inquisitor Morais, without the concurrence of his colleague Alvarado, decreed that Salas should be tortured, as guilty of concealment. In this act the following deposition is found: we ordain that the said torture be employed in the manner and during the time that we shall think proper, after having protested as we still protest, that, in case of injury, death, or fractured limbs, the fault can only be imputed to the said licentiate Salas. The decree of Morais took effect. I subjoin the verbal process of the execution. At Valladolid, on the 21st of June, 1527, the licentiate Morais, Inquisitor, caused the licentiate Juan de Salas to appear before him, and the sentence was read and notified to him. After the reading, the said licentiate Salas declared, that he had not said that of which he was accused, and the said licentiate Morais immediately caused him to be conducted to the chamber of torture, where, being stripped to his shirt, Salas was put by the shoulders into the chevalet, where the executioner, Pedro Porras, fastened him by the arms and legs with cords of hemp, of which he made 11 turns round each limb. Salas, during the time that the said Pedro was tying him thus, was warned to speak the truth several times, to which he always replied, that he had never said what he was accused of. He recited the creed, Quicumque Vult, and several times gave thanks to God and Our Lady, and the said Salas being still tied as before mentioned, a fine wet cloth was put over his face, and about a pint of water was poured into his mouth and
Damn.
nostrils, from an earthen vessel with a hole at the bottom,
Hey,
and
ew.
containing about 2 quarts. Nevertheless, Salas still persisted in denying the accusation. Then Pedro de Porras tightened the cords on the right leg, and poured a second measure of water on the face. The cords were tightened a second time on the same leg, but Juan de Salas still persisted in denying that he had ever said anything of the kind, and although pressed to tell the truth several times, he still denied the accusation. Then the said licentiate Morais, having declared that the torture was begun but not finished, commanded that it should cease. The accused was withdrawn from the chevalet or rack, at which execution, I, Henry Paz, was present from the beginning to the end. Henry Paz, notary. If this execution was but the beginning of the torture, how was it to finish? By the death of the sufferer? In order to understand this statement, it is necessary to know that the instrument, which in Castilian is called escalera, and which has also the name of burro, and is translated into French by the word chevalet, is a machine of wood, invented to torture the accused. It is formed like a groove, large enough to hold the body of a man, without a bottom, but a stick crosses it, over which the body falls in such a position, that the feet are much higher than the head. Consequently, a violent and painful respiration ensues, with intolerable pains in the sides, the arms, and legs, where the pressure of the cords is so great, even before the garrote has been used, that they penetrate to the bone. If we observe the manner in which the people who carry merchandise on mules or in carts tighten the cords by means of sticks, we can easily imagine the torments which the unfortunate John de Salas must have suffered. The introduction of a liquid is not less likely to kill those whom the inquisitors torture, and it has happened more than once. The mouth, during the torture, is in the most unfavorable position for respiration, so much so, that a person would die if he remained several hours in it. A piece of fine wet linen is introduced into the throat, on which the water from the vessel is poured so slowly, that it requires an hour to consume a pint, although it descends without intermission. Intermission. In this state the patient finds it impossible to breathe, as the water enters the nostrils at the same time, and the rupture of a blood vessel in the lungs is often the result. Raymond Gonzalez de Montes, who, in 1558, was so fortunate as to escape from the prisons of the Holy Office at Seville, wrote a book in Latin, on the Inquisition, under the name of Reginaldus Gonsalvius Montanus 9. He informs us that the cord was wound 8 or 10 times round the legs. 11 turns were made round the limbs of Salas, besides those of the garrote. We may form an idea of the humanity of the Inquisition of Valladolid, from the definitive sentence pronounced by the licentiate Morais and his colleague, Dr. Alvarado, without any other formality, after they had taken, if we may believe them, the advice of persons noted for their learning and virtue, but without the adjournment which ought to have preceded it, and without the concurrence of the diocesan in ordinary. They declared that the fiscal had not entirely proved the accusation, and that the prisoner had succeeded in destroying some of the charges, but that on account of the suspicion arising from the trial, Juan de Salas was condemned to the punishment of the public auto de fe, in his shirt, without a cloak, his head uncovered, and with a torch in his hand, that he should abjure heresy publicly, and that he should pay 10 ducats of gold to the Inquisition, and fulfill his penance in the church assigned. It is seen, by a certificate afterwards given in, that Juan de Salas performed his auto de fe on the 24th of June, 1528, and that his father paid the fine. The trial offers no other peculiarity. This affair, and several others of a similar nature, caused the Supreme Council to publish a decree in 1558, commanding that the torture should not be administered without an order from the council. Letter, orders, relating to the proceedings. The abuse of the secrecy of the proceedings caused a number of complaints to be addressed to the Inquisitor General. He usually referred them to the Supreme Council, which, during the administration of Manrique, addressed several circulars to the provincial tribunals. It is necessary to make known the most important. In one of these writings, dated March 14, 1528, it is said, that if an accused person, when asked a general question, declares at first that he knows nothing on the subject, and afterwards, when questioned on a particular fact, confesses that he is acquainted with it, in case the inquisitors think proper to take down the second declaration, to make use of it against a third, they should insert the first question and the answer of the accused in the same verbal process, because it might assist in determining the degree of confidence to be placed in his declarations. On the 16th of March, 1530, another instruction of the council appeared. It directed that the facts related by the witnesses in favor of the prisoner should be mentioned as well as those against him. This direction, however just, has not been strictly followed, since it was never observed in the extract of the publication of the depositions given to the accused and his defender. Consequently, no advantage could be derived by the prisoner from the declarations in his favor. Another circular of the 13th of May in the same year, says, that if an accused person challenges a witness, he must be interrogated on the foundation of the proceedings, as he might have facts to depose against the accused. On the June 16, 1531, the council wrote to the tribunals, that if the accused challenged several persons, on the supposition that they will depose against him, the witnesses whom he calls to prove the facts which caused the challenge, shall be examined on each individual, although they have not made any deposition, in order that the accused may not suppose at the time of the publication of the depositions, from an omission, if there should be any, that some have deposed against him, and that the others are not mentioned, or have not said anything. Another instruction on the 13th of May, 1532, directs, that the relations of the accused shall not be admitted as witnesses in the proof of the challenge. In another decree of the March 5, 1535, it is ordained that the witness shall be asked if there is any enmity between them and the accused. On the 20th of July, the council obliged the tribunals to insert in the extract of the publication of the depositions, the day, the month, and the hour when each witness gave his evidence. In March, 1525, it was decreed, that when the extract was given to the accused, he was not to be informed that any witness had declared the fact to be known to others, because if they said nothing against him, it was not proper to inform the accused of it, as he would learn, from that circumstance, that some persons had spoken in his favor, or at least had declared that they knew nothing against him. Another regulation of the 8th of April, 1533, prohibited the inquisitors from communicating the extract of the publication of the depositions to the accused, before the ratification of the declarations. The council decreed, on the 22 December, 1536, that in transacting any business relating to circumstances which took place in the house of a person deceased, so that the corpse was still exposed to view, and that its position, figure, or other circumstance, might tend to discover if he died a heretic or not, the name of the defunct, his house, and other details, should be communicated to the witnesses, that they might be enabled to recollect the event, and to assist them in making their declaration. Yet the council, on the August 30, 1537, decreed that the time and place of the events should be inserted in the extract of the publication of the depositions, because it was of consequence to the interests of the accused. It would be done even in supposing that he would learn from it the names of the witnesses. This rule is too contrary to the inquisitorial system, not to inspire a wish to seek for the principle and the cause. It may be found in the bad reputation which the Inquisition had acquired by the proceedings against Alfonso Virues, which induced Charles V to deprive it of the royal jurisdiction, but although the council registered the order of the sovereign, he decreed, on the 15th of December, in this year, and on the 22nd of February, 1538, that the extract should not contain any article which could make known the witnesses, thus annulling the order imposed in the preceding year. During the last years of the Inquisition, neither the time nor place were indicated in the act of the publication of the depositions. In June 1537, the council being consulted by the Inquisition of Toledo, decreed, as general rules first, that all who calmly uttered the blasphemies, "I deny God, I abjure God," should be punished severely, but those who uttered these words in anger, should not be subject to prosecution. Second, to punish all Christians accused of bigamy, if the guilty person supposed it permitted, and in the contrary case to abstain from prosecution. 3 RDLY, to ascertain, in cases of sorcery, if there had been any compact with the devil. If the compact had existed, the Inquisition was directed to judge the accused. If it had not, they were to leave the cause to the secular tribunals. The second and third of these regulations are contrary to the system of the Holy Office, which leads me to suppose that the temporary disgrace and exile of Manrique contributed to this moderation, which could not last long. The inquisitors have always proceeded against persons guilty of these crimes, on the pretense of examining if any circumstance might cause suspicion of heresy. The same spirit is found in another order of the February 19, 1533, it obliges the inquisitors to receive all the papers which the relations of the accused wish to communicate to them. The council made this rule, because these writings, though useless on the trial, might yet be serviceable in proving the innocence or guilt of the accused. On the May 10, 1531, the council decreed, that if bulls of dispensation from the use of the San Benito, imprisonment, or other punishments, were presented to the Inquisition, the procurator, fiscal should demand that they should be suppressed, as well as those obtained by the children and grandchildren of persons declared infamous by the Holy Office. The council supported this rule by alleging that children always followed the example of their heretical ancestors, and that it was a scandal to see them occupying honorable employments. On the 22nd of March in the same year, the council wrote to the Tribunal of the Provinces, that it had remarked, in one of the trials, that certain writings had not been digested in the places where the facts mentioned had happened, whence they concluded that these formalities had not been fulfilled at the proper time, but at the moment when the proceedings were to begin. The council then recommended them to avoid these abuses, as contrary to the instructions. But the orders of the council were not obeyed. The same irregularity was renewed, and produced another still more dangerous, which during my time had the most serious consequences. In order to supply what might be omitted in the course of the trial, the inquisitors adopted the custom of writing each act, declaration, and deposition on separate sheets of paper. As in these tribunals they did not make use of stamped paper, and as the pieces of the process were not numbered, it often happened that those which they wished to conceal from the council, the diocesan in ordinary, or other interested parties, were changed or suppressed. This maneuver was employed by the inquisitors in the affair of the Archbishop of Toledo, Carranza, and I have myself seen several attestations of the secretary changed at the request of the inquisitors of Madrid. The circular of the 11th of July in the same year is more remarkable, and had more success than the preceding. The inquisitors of the provinces were directed to refer to the Supreme Council all sentences pronounced without the unanimity of the inquisitors, the diocesan and the consultors, even supposing that there was only one dissentient voice. The inquisitors were afterwards obliged to consult the council on all the judgments which they passed, and I must confess that this measure was extremely useful, because, in a difference of opinion, the decisions of the Supreme were much more just than those of the tribunals of the provinces, from being composed of a greater number of enlightened judges. The council displayed the same love of justice in 1536, when it decreed that those convicted of making use of gold, silver, silk, or precious stones, should be punished by pecuniary fines, and not by fire, although they had been prohibited from so doing on pain of being relaxed. The decree most contrary to the wisdom which ought to have animated the council, was that of the 7th of December, 1532, in which it was ordained that each provincial inquisition should state the number and rank of the persons condemned to different punishments within their jurisdictions, since their establishment, and to deposit in the churches those San Benitos which had not been placed there, without even accepting those of persons who had confessed and suffered their punishment during the term of grace. This direction was executed with a severity worthy of the Inquisition. At Toledo those San Benitos were renewed which had been destroyed by time, and they were likewise sent to the parishes of the condemned persons. The consequences of these proceedings were the ruin and extinction of many families, as the children could not establish themselves according to the rank they had possessed, while the condemnation of their ancestors by the Inquisition remained unknown. The council discovered too late the injustice it had committed in respect to the San Benito, since it revoked the decree 7 years after, in 1539. It is not necessary to give the history of the quarrels which took place between the Inquisition and the different civil authorities, during the administration of Manrique. A scandalous enterprise of the Supreme Council ought nevertheless to be mentioned. In 1531, it presumed to condemn the President of the Royal Court of Appeals, in Majorca, to ask pardon of the Holy Office, to attend Mass, as a penitent, with a wax taper in his hand, and to receive the absolution of censures, for having defended the jurisdiction of the criminal tribunal in an affair which involved several persons, among whom was one Gabriel Nebel, a servant of the summoner of the Holy Office.